Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and another week. And an enduring myth about wartime London is that despite the bombs, the streets had never been safer. Well, actually, the enforced blackout enabled murderers and criminals to cover their tracks, and the war years saw numerous horrible crimes. Amy Helen Bell joins me to talk about her new book. Here's my copy of it. Links are in the description below. As always, you can find it in your favorite bookstore. And I'm looking forward to speaking to her. So good afternoon where you are. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
So, yeah, thank you for being here. So you're writing about London, but you live in the other London. You live in the London in Ontario. So that's going to be confusing.
Yes, especially when you're trying to fly London to London and people get very confused.
Oh, yeah, that would just do my brain in. So before we bring your PowerPoint up, one of the things I want to start with is how you define yourself as a historian. Are you a writer, researcher, journalist? Obviously, you're a qualified historian, but do you have a particular label you like to use to describe yourself or perhaps your work?
I think when it comes to my job, I'm a university teacher, so a university professor. So my work is heavily influenced by teaching and what students are interested in and collaborating with them. But my own work, I would say I'm a social historian. I'm really interested in people. And although I've studied a lot of crime and forensics and policing, I'm still mostly interested in the human side of war and the human side of crime.
Well, we're glad to have you there because that's one of the things I'm interested in as well. So we'll bring up your PowerPoint and I'll hand it over to you. But as always, folks, feel free to jump in with questions and comments. But there are a lot of slides, lots of information coming your way. So I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this thing. I was just chatting to Amy before going live. Is my grandmother was born in that part, the part of London that we're going to be talking about, and big connections for me with that and growing up and hearing all the stories. And it's still this myth that, you could leave your door open and it was so wonderful back then, but it's not really true. So over to you. Let's do this.
Yes, it wasn't all roll out the barrel and stiff upper lip. So that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to talk about crime in wartime London. And I'll start off by talking a little bit about London in World War II and kind of put it in the context of the overall history of the war. And then I want to talk a little bit about crime generally and what happened in London during the war. And then I want to focus on my own special interest, which is murder in the war. And I'll give some case studies of that. So when we look at histories of World War II, especially of London, there's always been this emphasis on civilian courage. London can take it. Keep calm and carry on. This is a propaganda poster from the Imperial War Museum. And it was very much the idea that civilians were the new combatants. It was a total war, but Londoners were going to take it, and their courage, as it says here, will bring us victory. But that doesn't tell the whole story. And part of the problem for historians who are going back and looking to see how people experienced the war was that, first of all, there's all this propaganda. And secondly, there's a lot of censorship. So people weren't able to talk about being afraid or angry or worrying about not winning the war. And so in my earlier work, one of the ways I tried to look at civilian experiences was looking at what people actually wrote. So letters and diaries, memoirs in certain cases. So in my first book, I talk a lot about that, how Londoners themselves wrote about the war. And I mean, obviously that was great, but that still didn't get to the kind of darker side that I wanted to tell, because mostly letters and diaries survive when people survive. And there's a whole realm of war experiences that were darker. So one of the ways to look at people's darker experiences is through histories of crime. So this shows us not only a way that people behaved behind the propaganda. So not everybody wanted to have equal shares. Not everyone was helping their neighbor or being courageous or being calm. So you see that dark underside. But even more importantly than that, for me, is that crime records show the stories of people who left no other written record. So people that didn't write diaries or so really people who were living in quite desperate circumstances. And one of the things about the files that I work with, which are a lot of police investigation files, they have a lot of detail about people's lives. They go and interview neighbors, they visit the home, they go to the workplace. And so you get a real sense of how people actually lived in the war, rather than how they were represented in propaganda or in films. So looking at war's effects on crime, from the very beginning of the war, you can see crime rates increase dramatically. And that's partly because all kinds of new crimes were created. So from 1939 onwards, there are huge restrictions on the blackout rules. There was rationing in 1940. There's rules against sedition. You've got conscription of men in 1939 and women in 1941. So there are enormous amount of rules put on civilians, which were obviously broken many times. And there were also new temptations. So during bombing raids, people were tempted by looting. So jewelry is just out on the street or it's out in the open. There are a lot of robberies, especially as the war went on, especially after there were more and more kind of deserters and soldiers in the capital. There were a lot of violent attacks. There are sexual attacks. And at the same time, there's all of this increase in crime. The number of police and detectives in London on the home front goes down dramatically. So metropolitan police force is about 20,000 in 1939. 1945, it's 4,000. And that's people leaving the force, being called up. And yeah, an enormous loss. And plus there are all these other new crimes to police. They have to catch deserters. They have to, all kinds of war regulations they have to enforce. And so they bring in war reserve policemen, which are civilians that are policemen for the duration. But even then, most wartime policemen are walking double the number of beats. They're doing double the workload. They can't keep up with the crime. Also, in my work, I'm interested in the emotional effects of war. And what I found is that people act more impulsively during the war because of these heightened emotions. And during the war, especially the early years of war, people are very afraid and anxious. They don't know what's coming. They're worried about their family. Later on in the war, there's a lot of aggression out in the streets between strangers. There's a lot of kind of lust and desperation. People are drinking more. There's a lot of fights out in the street between populations that don't like each other because of race or class or nationality. And added to that, the physical conditions of war, like what actually happens in London as a result of the war, make it easier for murderers to hide their crimes. And so bringing all of this together, you have an enormous effect of the war on crime, especially on what I'm interested in, which is violent crime. But what this policeman doing here is trying to catch people with the speed limit who are going too fast in the blackout, and that's why he's wearing the white high-vis jersey. So Home Office pathologist Keith Simpson, who is someone who was making his name in the war, he wrote a memoir in the 70s, and he described the war as a huge upsurge in crime, especially the kind of postmortems that he did. And he wrote, the war led to a steady flow of rapes, assaults, abortions, infanticides, and breaking into deserted houses, all arising from the changes in life that were thrust by service conditions on ordinary people. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that civilians in London were being expected to have military discipline. They were the focus of attack. They had to adhere to rationing. There were all kinds of rules controlling their movement and where they worked and where they slept and what they did. And it was very difficult for 6 years for civilians to adhere to that discipline completely. So in my latest book, which Paul showed the cover of, I explore a series of case studies looking at the kinds of murders that we see in war and some of the changes that happened over the course of the war, focusing really not just on kind of the killers and the forensic. My previous work was very much focused on forensic and the kind of scientific investigation of war. Here I'm looking more at the relationships between people and the people that knew each other and how they come to this basically crisis during the war that leads to someone's death. So what I argue in this book is that the war created a new character of murder, one that was desperate and brutal and often random. And this is very different from the kind of violence that we see in 1930s London, which tends to be local. It tends to be within the family. It's a lot of domestic violence or fights at the pub that get out of hand, drunken altercations, very much focused on people that know each other intimately. And that changes in the war. And that's because of the social dislocation. People are moving around so much. Families are broken up. There are all kinds of strangers coming in. And there's the emotional toll of war. People have to go through a lot, and their emotional reactions increase the likelihood of deadly violence. And that's true in the family and among strangers. And the physical landscape of the war helped to hide both the murders. So a lot of murders take place actually in bomb sites or in bomb shelters, and they also help to hide the bodies.
And I just suppose your awareness as a civilian in London, when there are major threats to your human life, such as bombing raids and aircraft crashing and unexploded bombs and all the other things that go along with it, and army maneuvers in the fields around your house, that your normal kind of awareness of just walking back late at night is dropping, I suppose. And then add that to what you've been saying about the blackout and the lack of police and that, and it's a recipe for potential disaster, as I'm sure you're going to explain.
Well, yeah, it's like you can see it as a double danger. You're in danger from the enemy that you can't see, from bombs from the air, but you're also in danger from your neighbor or from that stranger in the darkness. And it's that double danger that makes murders in London so unique.
Thank you.
So if we look at the timeline of London during the war, there are different phases according to what's happening militarily. The first phase of the war from 1939 onwards, nothing happens. It's called the Foti War, which I'm sure you know. And that's a period just of anxious waiting in London. That gets broken up by the Battle of Britain taking place in the skies in the summer of 1940. And then London is under direct attack from September 1940 to May 1941, pretty much unremittingly in the fall, and then in kind of sporadic but heavier and heavier raids in the spring 1941. And that's the period where we see a lot of physical destruction in London. Then there's a bit of a lull when operations are taking place, Russia and overseas. And then when America enters the war, we really start to see a second phase in London. And so now Britain has an ally. The Americans are coming over almost immediately. They're coming in January 1942 into London, bringing money and excitement and a bit of relief. And then we have a period of a huge influx of soldiers kind of building up in London, a lot more sociability. There's a lot more money. You have that start to falter. And so that increases up until the lead up to D-Day. And then in 1944, coinciding with that, in 1945, you have another period of deadly attacks on London, this time by unmanned weapons. So first of all, the Doodlebug raids, the V1 raids in the fall of 1945, and then the really deadly V2 missiles that are coming over. And those continue almost until the end of the war. I think the last one comes over in March of 1945. And in that case, people couldn't shelter from those. And so it caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of material destruction as well. And then you've got Victory, VE Day, May 8th, VJ Day, August 15th. But what's interesting from the period of violence is that the violence does not stop then. In fact, it increases after that with demobilization, because again, you have servicemen coming through London as they're being demobilized, and you also have servicemen coming back to families that may not be there, or unfaithful wives or what have you. And you also have a lot of social dislocation. And it's also in the history of London, it's not often remembered that the conditions of war actually continue till 1953, because that's when rationing actually ends. And so we can see, I guess really you could say 3 periods of war: the early period, the periods when the Americans are there, and then kind of the aftermath. And when we're talking about the timeline of murders in World War II London, we see that timeline follow those phases of war. So in the first phase of war, you've got really a period of anxiety and of mercy killings and murder-suicides within the family. And then in the second half of war, the murder rates go up and you have a lot more opportunistic, racially motivated murders during robberies. And as I'll talk about, 3 serial killers operating in wartime London. So all fairly well known. There's Gordon Cummins, the Blackout Ripper from 1942. He's the only one that actually gets caught during the war. Then there's John Reg Christie in 1943. Who continues till 1953, and then there's John Hay from 1944. And we can see how all 3 of them start their careers in London during the war because the war created conditions in which they could attract their victims and hide their crimes. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So if we look at the first part of the war, you can see it's really about the transformation of London, even before the bombs start to fall. So there's Neville Chamberlain declaring war on September 3rd, 1939. That's at 11 a.m. Very famous speech. And then 45 minutes later, the air raid sirens go off. And it's a false alarm, but people are terrified because they are convinced that London is about to be under immediate attack by the Germans. And that they are going to suffer enormously. And of course, they have the example of the Spanish Civil War and civilian bombing, most famously in Guernica in 1937. And what was especially talked about in the Spanish Civil War was the death of children and the vulnerability of children. And so people are very frightened, not just for themselves, but for their families at the outbreak of war. So people were worried from the very beginning. Well, really, from 1938, they know that war is coming. And so there's a profound sense of anxiety for Londoners, especially. Londoners know they're going to be the first under attack. They're worried about the attack themselves, but they're also worried about what will happen to their families. And they're also worried about being frightened. So they're worried about maintaining that stiff upper lip. Are they going to be able to maintain morale? Are they going to be able to control themselves in the shelter and control themselves publicly the way that a good citizen should?
So this is the whole Churchill's intention was, I suppose, to build this spirit based on honesty. We were particularly fighting a regime where propaganda was used to conceal and hoodwink and brainwash, essentially. So the regime as set up by Churchill is one of honesty, but that will only get certain people on their side. It will also allow, telling people it'll be all right will convince some people it will be all right, but some people will be convinced that if they're saying it's all right, it's definitely not going to be all right. So it's a complicated balancing act for the government to have to deal with in sort of 39-40 about how honest are we going to be. We can't pretend things aren't going to get serious, but at the same time we've got to instill this idea that we can deal with it. And as from your work, do you think Churchill and the British government kind of got it right in those early years?
Well, I do think the thing is it's a double standard. So Churchill and the government ministers could control propaganda and control the message, but ordinary civilians were not allowed. It was prohibited to express any fear, to publicly say that we're not going to win the war, to go into a bomb shelter and say Germany's going to win, or we should sue for peace. And there are all kinds of examples of people being hauled up before the magistrates and being fined, like not enormous amounts, but £5, £10 for declaring things against the morale of continuing the war. And so it's honesty, but it's tinged with it's like things will be bad, but we'll ultimately win. And things look bleak, but because we're British, we will win. And so I'm not sure how much ordinary people felt that they could be honest about being afraid.
Yeah, and so it wasn't the way back then, was it? I mean, we've talked about it on the channel before, this whole idea of of bravery and cowardice, and how many soldiers that thought they were the only ones who were terrified, but after the war, that reunions, they spoke to their friends and found out they were all terrified, and yet somehow there was this veil of well, it must just be me, everyone else is fine. And you know, my grandmother, who was kind of, you know, experienced the Blitz, is kind of I thought everyone else was fine, but the reality is most people presumably were terrified on some level.
Well, yeah, and it's really interesting that in my earlier work on diaries, that people would write about other people being afraid. So a child being afraid in the shelter, and they describe it, or they describe that they have stomach aches, or their hair's falling out, or they can't sleep. So they described physical symptoms of stress and anxiety, but even in their diaries, they couldn't quite admit how frightened they were. And that's another interesting thing about these crime files, is that they show how frightened people actually were because of the actions, because that fear propelled them to commit violent acts against people they loved.
Yeah. Oh, well, back to you. It's a fascinating subject.
So I would say people were most worried either about their children or about their elderly parents. And we can see that also in government evacuation schemes. So even before war is declared, there is an enormous voluntary, so parents didn't have to send their children away, evacuation scheme where 1.5 million people were voluntarily evacuated from British cities, most of those from London, and 2 million more were evacuated privately. So that's 3.5 million, mostly children by themselves, some pregnant women or women with young children, some handicapped, vulnerable people, some older people, although most older people chose to stay. They didn't want to leave. And so immediately you have the people who are left in London, who are working adults, separated from their children, very unhappy, a lot of stress and anxiety because of that. And so when we look at the propaganda photos of evacuation of children, you'll notice that they never show pictures of crying children. Those were not allowed to be published. They're all happy and there are no crying adults. It's all seen as a big adventure. And we know, of course, from social history that for many that was not true. It was very traumatic. So one of the first cases I talk about is really a terrible tragedy that is brought about by that threat of family separation. And it's the death of little Marion Alalemjan. She's only 5 years old. And at the time, so at the outbreak of war, she's living in London. Her family is living in London. And her father and older siblings decide to go to Switzerland for a family holiday. They're an upper middle class family. So they're in Switzerland on September 3rd, 1939, and they get trapped there. And so Marion is left with her nurse in London. And so they evacuate briefly and then they come back. And then Marion's father writes to the nurse, Claudia Valeriani, and says, I'm going to apply for passports for visas to go to the US, and we're all going to emigrate to the US, and Marion's going to come with us. So basically telling Claudia that not only was she going to be separated from Marion as soon as those visas came through, but that she'd also be out of a job. And she was a 50-year-old woman. She'd had a very hard life, and her specialty had been taking children across the Atlantic without their parents. And of course, after 1939, there isn't going to be any more of that kind of work. And so she writes a series of letters to people saying what she's going to do. And then she writes the letter to Marion's grandfather, who lives in London, and the police come and find them both dead, that Claudia has turned on the gas taps with them in the kitchen, and they both die in the kitchen. And it's enormously sad for everybody because Marion, and it's clear that in the inquest, which is because, of course, there's no trial because Claudia has died, it comes out how much Claudia loved Marion so much. She didn't want to be separated, and she was worried what was going to happen to her because Marion's mother had died. The family was quite a reserved family, and she didn't want to be separated from the United States. And actually, Marion still has surviving nieces and nephews. They did emigrate to the United States. I still remember her and have her picture, and I was able to talk to them in the writing of this book. So it was a very sad story that's really, I think, emblematic of that first year of war and the anxieties that people felt. Also, during the first year of war, you've got physical changes in London that make hiding crime much, much easier. So obviously, all outside lights had to be put out in the blackout. The idea was that the lights of London would attract enemy bombers. And so people had to put up, you can see there's blackout curtains here, quite fancy ones. This is an image suggesting that people wear high visibility clothing in the blackout, although I don't think anyone ever would wear this or wore this. And they painted curbs, and they also painted the signs to shelters in this high visibility white paint. Because, of course, the major casualty in the first year of war during the Phony War was road accidents.
Yep.
It was so dark, people were stepping off the curb or getting hit by cars and buses and dying that way. Street signs were also taken down in case any invading enemy would come, so that they'd be more confused about where they were going. Public bomb shelters were built. So in the first year of war, they built trench shelters in the park, but they quickly realized that those were not going to work. And so there were public shelters commandeered, but also built into basements and reinforced buildings. And there were also surface shelters built in neighborhoods that didn't have basements, such as the East End. And then these were, of course, put to use during the huge bombing raids of the London Blitz. And here we have an example of some of the heavy mine explosions that we saw. Most of the bombing was concentrated kind of in the south and east, although a stray bomb hit Buckingham Palace, to the great relief of the royal family, I think, who had themselves photographed in front of it to show that they were suffering just as much as the East Enders. So what's interesting about the period of the Blitz is actually there is very little violence during this time, because people are just trying to survive. The raids are taking all night. They're sheltering in public shelters. And the main, I'll come back to this, the main crime is actually looting. So that because there's so much kind of goods available and out on the street, and it's the blackout, as that people would just go and take, especially from businesses that had been looted. And looting, sorry.
So the looting, is it mostly individuals, or is it starting to see kind of organized groups and gangs doing this, or is it both?
In 1940, it's mostly individuals, but it's starting to be organized by individuals and organized crime. So organized crime is mostly into black marketing and like forging ration books, but they will do organized robberies, like using an ARP vehicle or ARP armbands, go into premises like pubs and take the alcohol or things like that. So looting is technically punishable by death during the war or penal servitude for life, but there's never any penalty enacted like that. And of course, the most famous case, the looting, the Café de Paris was a nightclub in the West End, and it was supposed to be bomb-proof because they had a reinforced basement, but a bomb actually came through the roof straight down onto the bandstand while the band was playing, and killed almost everyone on the dance floor and the band. And what injured people, survivors, remember is that they're lying there in the darkness, and of course bombs create a lot of dust. It's very hard to see. They're waiting for help to come, and they feel looters come and take the rings off their fingers and take their handbags, because of course it's a very wealthy area. So the Blitz really saw an outbreak of that kind of crime. And the one other kind of crime we see again are what we could call mercy killings. So we see these kinds of violence. I think there are 3 cases of this in London where people kill their elderly parent or their elderly spouse. A woman kills her husband who's blind because they can't get them to the shelters and they don't want them to be heard. So this is a case of James Miller, who was living with his mother and another brother and in the East End in Bethnal Green. And he was working as a rescue worker, so someone who would go in after the bomb and help people who had survived. And he had seen, of course, terrible things in September, very heavy raids in the East End. And his mother was 75, and she couldn't get down to the shelter fast enough. She had to go downstairs, and it was a public shelter outside, walk down the street. And he was so concerned about what would happen to her that he strangled her to put her out of her misery. And he was found guilty but insane. So essentially that he was mentally ill because of what he had seen during the raids, and he wasn't criminally responsible for his mother. So terrible, tragic story. And then, of course, it really is 1940 when we see the growth of the black market and of organized crime. So this is Billy Hill, who would become one of the big post-war gang members. There had been gangs in London in the 1930s. There's a bit of a lull in the 40s. I do talk about one gangland killing in London during the war, but what the gangs were mostly doing was making money during the war. So Billy Hill wrote in his autobiography, 1955, someday someone should write a treatise on Britain's wartime black market. It was the most fantastic side of civilian life in wartime. Make no mistake, it cost Britain millions of pounds. I didn't merely make use of the black market, I fed it. So this idea that this was all organized crime, even though in reality, mostly it was ordinary people who were doing it.
And it makes sense that if opportunities are plentiful, which is what these gangs are finding, there's no need to kind of go into the, knocking off rival gang members. That's something I kind of think of in the 60s and the craze and things, when businesses are starting to have alarms, and perhaps there isn't the easy crime there was 20 years earlier. So you're competing for the turf. But I guess in wartime London, there was so much opportunity around. There was no need to kind of be jealous of the other gang. Is that am I right with that?
Well, there were territorial fights, but they tended to be not deadly. So that it was mostly cutting with knives. So Billy Hill was famous for whenever he wanted to get at a rival, he called it chivying, that he'd slash their cheeks with razors. And then in the war, he writes in his autobiography that he changed this, that he slashes a V for victory because he's so patriotic. Right?
So that's weird logic, that is. Yeah, okay.
He's a weird guy. But the idea that they're mostly there to make money, and that the violence is more about performance, right? Like I'll razor your suit because clothing is rationed and you can't get a new one. But you wouldn't actually kill someone because they don't want to go to prison. They want to make money.
Wow.
So I want to give an example here of a really interesting case I talk about in the book, and it's the case of the murder of Rachel Dobkin, who you see here, who's murdered in April 1941 by her estranged husband, but he tried to cover up her death by staging it to look like a bombing, and it almost worked. And so it's a really interesting case, I think, about a murderer taking advantage of the conditions of war. So if we look at the history of this couple, they're very unhappy. They're unhappily married. So their marriage was arranged by a marriage broker, a Jewish marriage broker, and they marry in 1920, but they separate almost immediately. It is not a success. So they have one son, Stanley, but they live together maybe a week, maybe a month, and then they don't really live together again. And so Harry Dobkin moves back with his parents. Then he takes a job as a ship steward. He's always away, and he's supposed to pay Rachel maintenance money, and he doesn't want to. And so she's always trying to catch him in the street, getting him to pay her the money, pay the child support for Stanley, and he either tries to avoid her or he hits her. He goes to prison 3 times for non-payment. She accuses him of stealing. He accuses her of having an illegal abortion. So they're always in the magistrate's court, kind of fighting with each other for 20 years. So they're well known to the police. They are part, really, I mean, another way that the story is interesting is they're part of a vanishing East End. They're both from Russian Jewish immigrant families. I think Rachel is born in London, but Harry comes over at a few months old. They're in this vibrant East End culture. They mostly live in housing estates that are set up by Jewish philanthropists, and they take part in that Jewish cultural life. And so Harry, like his father, before the war, makes a really good living as a market trader. So he gets aprons and pockets, which are like little pouches that women would carry, and he sells them in the markets like this one, Petticoat Lane. But in the war, once war is declared, there's a shortage of material, which is later rationed. And so he has to take a second job. And the second job is of a fire watcher. And this was a job that businesses would hire pretty much anyone to come and watch and check for incendiary bombs. So on April 11th, 1941, Rachel and Harry meet for the last time. She's trying to get him to come back with her, says that she'll give him some onions, or that she wants to live together again. And he puts her off and says, yeah, sure, whatever you say, I'll talk to you later. And so the waitress remembers them at this cafe at 374 Kingsland Road in Dalston. And then supposedly Rachel gets on a bus to go home back to the East End, and Harry gets on his bus down to Kennington, where he's a fire watcher, which is quite a long way. You can see how really they cross all of London at this time. But Rachel never shows up. And so her family waits for her. The next day they go to her bed, hasn't been slept in. And the very first thing that her sister does, Paula Dubinsky, is go to the police and report her missing, and says she hasn't been home. That's not like her. She's never done that before. And after a few days, Rachel still doesn't turn up. Polly goes back to the police and says, Harry's murdered her. So I think she's a victim of violence. You have to investigate her murder. But because she says that she has heard this because of psychics, she's consulted psychics, the police don't really believe her. And they also think that Rachel Dubinsky is just mentally deficient. She's mentally ill. She's just disappeared. And yet, at the same time, April 15th, a fire breaks out in the chapel next door to where Harry is a fire watcher. And although he is the fire watcher, he doesn't call the fire department. So the fire burns for a few hours, and then a passing police constable calls in the fire department. They eventually quell the fire, and Harry is seen there quite excited, and there seems to be a straw mattress that's spread around it. So it's quite suspicious. But the very next day, there's a very heavy raid in Kennington, and 67 local people are killed, and people forget about the fire. And here we see, this is a bomb damage map of Kennington. You can kind of see the oval there, so you can get a sense of just how heavy the raids were here in South London. So a year passes, Rachel doesn't show up. The police assume that she's just killed herself or been the victim of a raid, and that Harry is innocent, until July 1942, a demolition worker working in the chapel discovers a body in the basement. And at first, it's under a very heavy slab. He puts it on a shovel, puts it to one side, because he thinks it's just a bomb victim, and that he will just take it to the mortuary and they'll put it with the other unidentified bomb victims, of which there were hundreds during the war.
Of course.
Yeah. And there was no great rush about it. So the local coroner actually gives the body, which is mostly a skeleton, to Keith Simpson, the pathologist that we talked about, who immediately says, this is not a bomb victim, it's a murder victim. The body's been dismembered. It's been burned in places. You could see that the hyoid bone had been broken and there's a blood clot on it. So it's someone who's died by strangulation. And someone has sprinkled slaked lime on her to try to preserve, or to try to decompose the body, but to just preserve it. So it's not a natural death. And so over the next few months, he links up with the Southwark Detective Branch, and they trace Rachel Dobkin through Paula Dubinsky's missing persons report and her dental records, and forensically prove that it's Rachel Dobkin in the basement. And so Keith Simpson really becomes the star of this because of all the forensic details that he does. And the most intriguing visual proof is that he takes a photograph of the skull that's discovered in the basement and superimposes a photo of Rachel Dobkin in life, of which there's only two. And you can see the image there. And this is a press photograph of DC Rawlings looking at this court exhibit. And so Henry Dobkin is arrested, brought to trial. He denies everything. But even though there's nothing linking him, there's no witnesses, there are no bloodstains, there's no theory of how he got his wife into that basement, just the circumstantial fact that his wife's body shows up next door to where he's a fire watcher. The jury finds him guilty in 35 minutes and he's sentenced to death. So he tries to appeal, saying that the evidence is too weak. It's denied. There are all kinds of petitions. He writes letters. This is an excerpt from one of his letters where he's trying to at least get his death sentence commuted, but there's very little sympathy for him, and he is hanged in 1942. And the reason why I find this case so interesting is it kind of acts as a bridge between the unhappy family murders that we see in the first part of the war and the stranger murders and the kind of opportunistic murders of people trying to cover up their crimes in the second half of the war.
Because that, if this obviously this made the press, if you're a person in an unhappy marriage or you've got someone you want to bump off, this is just going to give you ideas. It's you know, well, that's a good way, isn't it? I'll bump him or her off and I'll try and disguise it as an air raid, and I'll just do better than this guy who didn't do it very well. It's yeah, wow, that's fascinating. I mean, and how did the press report it as a big story? Was it kind of buried a bit, no pun intended, kind of on the secondary pages? Because 42, there's a lot of bad news from around the world then.
I think that is part of the problem. And Keith Simpson actually complains about this in his autobiography, that it should have been the case of a lifetime and it should have made his name. But 1942, people are worried. And so it is reported. You can find newspaper clippings about it, but people don't focus on it. I mean, this is also the same year, you know, that Gordon Cummins is caught and hanged. So there is all this murder, but people are worried more about the war than about this.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that when there's not much going on, a kind of a juicy murder in the news becomes very interesting, almost escapism for people. But in the middle of a war, the last thing you want to read about, the last thing you'd be gossiping about with your neighbors, oh, did you hear about that murder down the road? When you're worried about, you know, the first Battle of El Alamein or British losses in the Mediterranean or the U-boat losses or whatever it be. It's fascinating that the times in which something happens affecting how much interest there is in that thing.
Well, yeah, and also because at this time people get most of their crime news through newspapers, and the newspapers, of course, are full of war news, so it goes to the back, and in a way that you don't see later on when it really is more the tabloid newspapers putting it more to the front.
In fact, we got a question earlier that I'll ask now from Rob about. I guess local newspapers also lost lots of their staff for the duration, so their capacity to report court cases went down just when crime itself was going up. Must have affected public perceptions. Is Rob right with that?
I think it is true. There was coverage of local courts, and there were journalists still doing that. But when it also comes to people coming to sit in on trials, the way they did at the Old Bailey and the way they did at the other courts, people are less willing to kind of go into the courts and to be spectators themselves, which I think generates a lot of the public interest. So it is reported, but it's also considered, I think, bad taste or not quite the thing to talk too much about it. So you read the events, but it's not, especially in cases like this where there's a surviving child. And we see that in another case that I talk about, the children are surviving. And so there is reportage about it, but it tends to be respectful to the family in a way that we don't see later on. Okay,
thank you.
So moving into phase 2 of the war, this is really the period from 1942 to 1946. And this is a period full of strain. There are millions of UK, Allied, and Commonwealth servicemen passing through London. They're there on leave. They're stationed there. And as the war goes on, there's at least 10,000 British deserters around London, and there are more Canadian, American deserters, all having to live without any money, without any ration books. So they basically have to steal to live or be protected by someone. They're living in a legal existence. And so this is the time period when we see crime rates really going up. And this is some work I've done looking at murder rates in London. So you can see they start to go up in 1942, 1943, 1944, and then spike in 1945. So this is really the most violent period for 20 years on either side. What's also interesting about the relationships of people in these violent attacks is that mostly before 1942, it's people who know each other. And then you have a lot of cases from 1942 onwards where people don't, where it's just a casual, they've just met that day, or it's a more opportunistic crime. And we see that pattern continue after the war. Probably the most famous case during the war of a killer was Gordon Cummins, the Blackout Ripper of 1942. So he is the first serial killer that really starts to kill during the war. And he is 28 at the time that he's arrested. He's had a fairly normal life. He's in the RAF. He's fairly not well liked, but he has people to go out with. He's not shunned. He's quite pretentious, and he tends to be a petty thief, so people don't really trust him, but he has no history of violence. He's happily married, although he doesn't live with his wife. But for whatever reason, something is triggered in him, or there is some kind of event, and he starts to kill women in rapid succession. So the first woman, and there may have been other murders in 1941. I'm not convinced by that. The police try to clear up unsolved mysteries by saying that it was Gordon Cummins, but I don't know. His first known victim is Evelyn Margaret Hamilton. And she was just someone who was in London for one night. She's a chemist. She was going to switch trains in the morning. She's walking alone from the Lions Corner house back to her rented room at around 11 o'clock at night, and she never gets there. She's found strangled in an empty bomb shelter in Bloomsbury. Her clothing is disarranged, and she's missing her handbag, but there are no clues. And she doesn't know anyone in London, so it wouldn't have been anyone that she knew. The very next night, Evelyn Oatley, who's a nightclub hostess, is found dead in her flat in Soho, strangled, and in her case, her body is mutilated. The very next night after that, Margaret Lowe is found dead by her daughter, who's coming up to visit for the weekend, and her flat's in Fitzrovia. The very next night, sex worker Catherine Mulcahy is attacked, but she kept her boots on during the sex act and is able to fend off her attacker with her boots and escape next door to her neighbors. And so she reports this to the police and is able to provide a description. So she escapes. But that same night, Doris Juanet is found dead in her Paddington flat by her husband returning from work. And it's very interesting if you look at the geographical pattern, is that this is really all over central London. It's not just one neighborhood. None of these women know each other. The police really are getting very frightened. They have no clues whatsoever, other than they find some fingerprints, but the fingerprints aren't in the database. They have nothing to tell them anything about this killer. And then they have an amazing stroke of luck. A woman named Margaret Haywood, or Greta Haywood, is having a drink in the Trocadero, and this handsome blonde RAF man sits next to her, and they start chatting, and he buys her a sandwich, and I think she writes down his number for her, and she is going on to meet another friend, and he said, "I'll walk you there." And so they go out into the blackout, and he starts walking her the wrong way. And he pushes her into a doorway in Piccadilly and starts kissing her. And she says, "No, no, no." And then he starts choking her and strangling her. But at that moment, an 18-year-old man, John Shine, is passing by the street and sees this happening and shouts out saying, "Stop, stop." And Cummins is frightened, and he drops his RAF gas mask and his haversack, and he runs. And so Shine collects Greta and then takes her to the police station. They bring the RAF gas mask, and this is the first real clue. And within a day, they've traced the gas mask back to Gordon Cummins. They found objects from all of his victims at his billet. They match his fingerprints to Evelyn Oatley's room, and he's committed for trial. So again, he never admits his guilt. His wife is convinced that he's innocent, that it was all just a terrible mistake. But he is found guilty and he's hanged. I mean, this is another thing about wartime justice. People are hanged very quickly. So there's really very little gap between the guilty verdict and the death sentence. and he's hanged in June 25th, 1942 at Wandsworth. And you did some work on this, Paul, in a reenactment.
I did a documentary sort of 30 years ago. We were chatting earlier, Amy and I had to provide the victims and a Cummins, who's my friend Dickie Townsley, who was working as an extra. So we did some sort of that kind of blurry footage. They were just going to be putting in amongst talking heads and things like that. But the question I want to ask is one that one of the viewers asked earlier on. It's about, there's still lots of questions about exactly what kind of guy he was, and is he a psychopath, even whether or not he was guilty. But the question I want to ask is about this whole normalizing of violence in the war, in that he is in the RAF, he has been involved with armaments, and he's going to be training for aircrew and things like that, where on a daily basis you're being talked about killing the enemy, defending yourself, firing machine guns, dropping bombs, firing torpedoes. Is it a fair question to ask you that, had there not been a war, had he been a civilian RAF person, or where he'd been in another job, would the circumstances have not occurred for him to go over it? I mean, I know it's a stupid question you can't possibly answer, but I have to think that the environment of death being a normal thing has to add to this.
Oh, absolutely. And I think at the same time that people were frightened during the war, other people were excited by it, and excited, like not excited necessarily in a murderous way, but it was exciting and dramatic. And there was a lot of tension, and the blackout kind of made all kinds of things possible. It was a surreal moment. And it really felt for a lot of people like a moment in which there's no future. And so therefore there's no consequences. And it's not just the physical aspects of the blackout, it's that mental aspect that lowered people's inhibitions. And certainly that contributed to a lot of these murderous attacks.
And I just get the normalization of people doing things. I mean, people would cheer in London when an enemy aircraft was shot down. I mean, they're literally cheering the death of a human being there, and that type of thing was happening, which doesn't happen in peacetime. That kind of being excited about the right death as opposed to the wrong death. People would be in aghast horror if they saw a Spitfire or a Hurricane going down, but would cheer when a Messerschmitt went down. And that's that tragedy of the war, that it normalizes actions and reactions that wouldn't be that way outside of the war environment. That it's a fascinating subject. I'm glad we're going into the social and the human studies of this, rather than just kind of a true crime thing where you are giving us the detail of the cases, but it's the circumstance, it's the mindset that's so fascinating.
Well, yeah, and really, in a way, it's the people that can't distinguish between the right death and the wrong death. If you're excited by death and the prospect of death, then that bleeds over into your everyday life. And we see that not only in kind of murderous attacks, but sexual violence as well, and the sexual violence that will happen that happened in Britain and on the continent after D-Day. So, and this I think brings me really well, thank you for that, to my next point, which is that people talk of killers all the time. And there's been so much true crime interest in why serial killers did what they did. But what I'm interested in, especially in the book, is what about the victims? What happened in their lives that made them so vulnerable to predators? And in some cases, it's obvious. Children and pregnant women are always vulnerable to attack. They can't really defend themselves. And that's certainly the case in a lot of crime in London. But in other cases, it's the conditions of war that made people vulnerable, and the kind of dislocations that the war, especially young people, refugees, the dislocations they experienced that made them vulnerable. So I wanted to talk about an example of Ruth First from 1943, who was the first of John Reginald Christie's victims in the war. Now, she is a young woman. She's an Austrian refugee, and the conditions of war made her not only vulnerable to Christie, who kills her and buries her in the backyard. We can see Wellington Place in 1943. But the conditions of war also helped cover up her murder. She disappeared essentially for 10 years, and nothing more disappeared without a trace and without a lot of investigation. And here we see the second part of the slide is 10 Rillington Place now, which is a memorial garden.
Yeah.
So Ruth was born near Vienna in 1922. She was from a family, her dad was an artist. They were Jewish extraction, but they, I think, worshipped as Christians. And so when the Nazis invaded Austria, they come to Vienna. We see them here in March 1938. The family was afraid of what was going to happen to them. And they decided the best thing that they could do was to split up. That was their best chance for survival. And so the older brother went to Vienna, and the parents and I think another sibling tried to get through to the US. And Ruth used the services of what was called the Swedish Mission to help her emigrate. And the Swedish Mission was run by baptized Jews who were helping Jewish people that weren't able to access a lot of the Jewish philanthropic bodies at that time, and they helped Ruth to emigrate to the UK in 1939. So Austrian and German refugees, especially Jewish ones, there were obviously thousands and thousands of them trying to find visas all over the world and mostly being unsuccessful. The UK let in a limited amount, but one of the ways in which they let people in was with less popular jobs. So you could get in as a refugee, you could get a visa by working as a domestic servant. So of the 78,000 Austrian and German refugees that were let in before 1939, 20,000 of them came in as domestic servants. Even if they were middle class or higher class, that was the way that they had to come in, and that's how Ruth came in. So we see her here. She lands in the summer of 1939. Here she is at around that time. We find her in the England and Wales Register of September 1939, and she's working as a servant in a children's home. And this is the children's home, the St. Gabriel's Convalescent Home in Westgate-on-Sea, taking care of ill children by the sea. But by all accounts, she hates this. She doesn't like being a servant. It's really boring. She doesn't like being around children. And so she drifts back to London. She takes some other jobs as servants because she has to do that to maintain her visa until 1940 when she is interned. So all aliens who came into Britain before 1939 had to register. So here we see this is Ruth's registration card. And then on the outbreak of war, they had to appear before these special tribunals to see whether they were loyal or not. And so on her first tribunal, she is declared to be a true refugee. So she's escaping. She's a victim of Nazi aggression. And so she's not interned. But then in May 1940, all this changes because Britain's so vulnerable and in danger of imminent German attack, it's felt. And so 4,000 German and Austrian aliens are rounded up and interned over the course of about a week. So Ruth is one of these. And here we see women internees going to the Isle of Man. She probably went to the all-women's Russian camp on the Isle of Man, which was a little, would you say a holiday village. Mostly had boarding houses and holiday lets. And instead of building dormitories that were fenced off the way there were in the military camps and the men's camps, they just fenced off the whole village. And so women lived there and some children kind of cheek by jowl with the actual inhabitants of Russian. And so it was restrictive, but it also could have been quite nice. It was a very hot summer. The beach is right there. They had enough food. But probably Ruth was bored. And so she actually is let go 2 days before Christmas, 1940, and makes her way immediately back to London. In 1941, things are looking up. She's working at the Mayfair Hotel in Berkeley Square, really nice hotel, which will also give her a place to live. Oops. But she got pregnant. So she has an affair with a waiter. She gets pregnant, and as soon as she starts to show, she's fired. And then we know she's homeless that summer. So she's a pregnant, homeless Jewish refugee with no family. So the police call her in a couple times and warn her because aliens have to register their address, and they keep telling her, but they don't find her and they don't put her in prison. And she has a daughter in October 1942, Christina Sonia, at the West End Lane home for unmarried mothers in Hampstead, who's immediately given up for adoption. And then by 1943, Ruth has kind of put her life back together. She's got a better job. So outside of domestic service now, she's working at a munitions factory here at John Boulding and Sons, which is quite well paid. She's living up here. You can see at the very top of the screen at Oxford Gardens in Notting Hill, which is a whole row of Victorian terrace houses sublet into rooms. But if you can see on the map, just down there, there's a little cul-de-sac here that's called Ruxton Mews. That's actually Rillington Place. And on Rillington Place is John, who is going to become one of the most prolific serial killers of this time period. So Christie lived with his wife Ethel at the ground floor. And at this time, he's working as a war reserve policeman. From 1939 to 1943. And it's not really clear how he gets this job because he does have a record of thievery. He's been in jail. He has a record of violence. So either they didn't look into that or they overlooked it because war reserve policeman actually is a position of quite big responsibility and respectability. And so he's able to move freely in the blackout. His movements are not restricted. He gets to know everyone in the neighborhood. He knows where the deserters go, where the prostitutes go, and people look to him in his uniform as he goes on his beat in Notting Hill. So Ruth met Christie at David Griffin's refreshment room. This is it now, the corner of Lancaster Road and Ladbroke Grove, sometime in 1943. We only have his word for it of what actually happened, which is, of course, very unreliable. So according to him, they became friends. She was secretly, not so secretly, she was in love with him. She looked up to him because of his uniform and his maturity, because at this time he's a middle-aged man, and that she would follow him around on his beat, and he occasionally gave her money, and they had a sexual relationship, a consensual sexual relationship, according to him. Whether that's true or not seems very doubtful. If we look at his later career, it's probably more likely that he befriended her as a vulnerable woman and offered her some kind of free medical service, so such as an abortion or some kind of medical treatment or a way to lure her into his home while his wife was away. Because he did that in August 1943. He brought her into the home, and then he claimed while they were having sex, he killed her, hid her beneath the floorboards, and then buried her body in the backyard without anyone knowing. So the thing about Ruth is that she wasn't very connected in the city. So her landlady from Oxford Gardens reported her missing when she didn't pay the rent, but there essentially was no other investigation. There's no Polly Dubinsky. There's no sister who's for this. She's on her own. And so she's kind of forgotten, and nothing really happens. And Christie kind of goes on about his life. He leaves the war. So in here is where she's buried, in the garden at 10 Rillington Place. So he leaves the War Reserve after that and starts working at Ultra Radio. And there he's able to kill again. So Maria Eady was quite different. She was a very shy person. She was a bit older, but she suffered from nasal catarrh. So recurring sinus infections. And he lured her to Rillington Place, saying that he had a treatment for that, and then killed her as well and buried her in the backyard next to Ruth. Because this was 1944, her family, who did miss her, assumed that she'd been killed in a bombing raid, that she'd been killed by a V1 or a V2. And so they looked for her. They reported her missing eventually, but there wasn't any great sense of urgency about it. And so both of these women, these deaths were not discovered until 1943. So they lay in the back of 10 Rillington Place for 10 years. What's also interesting about them is that these, after this, after the end of the war, Christie doesn't have the opportunity to kill again. And so there's a lull. And he doesn't kill again until he kills his neighbors, Geraldine and Beryl Evans, in 1959, because he has the opportunity. But then at that time, it's Timothy Evans who's blamed. The husband is blamed. He's hanged. Christie is the main witness, prosecution witness, saying that it was all Timothy's fault. And it's not until 1953, when 4 more women have died and their bodies are actually discovered, that the police actually go and find Ruth and Muriel in the backyard. And this is the map of 10 Willington Place, where you can see that ground floor flat and where all the women's bodies were found, including 3 in the kitchen that were discovered in 1943. Those were the ones who were discovered first.
And it's a tragedy that 80 years on, we're still telling this story from Christie's point of view, using his clearly dodgy evidence that he gave all the time. And your work reminds me of the work by Hallie Rubenhold with the 5 about the women who were the murders of the victims of Jack the Ripper. We've always told the story from the point of view of the murderer, never the victims, and victims in all senses of the word, victims in victims of the crime, but also in these cases, victims of the circumstances of their status, his war acquired extra status that he probably shouldn't have got. And let's not go into the fact the police are probably a bit desperate for people. There's a lack of the males the right age. He comes along, he's got the gift of the gab, he's got sort of the right demeanor, and this situation is exactly what you're trying to get across, how the war has created this perfect storm of victims being in the wrong place because they can't get out of it, and murderers taking advantage of the wrong place to do what they do. It's shocking that it's still being told from. You're doing a fantastic job trying to turn the ship about, but it's the way we learn our history, unfortunately.
Well, it's also because Ruth really becomes a ghost. Like, there's nothing left of her, and so little is known of her. So by the time, I think my next slide is about this, is that by the time she's discovered, nobody remembers her. There's no one in London that knows her. No one's alive to miss her. Her landlady has died. And the only way that people know it's her is because of her dentistry work. And so you can see it was not just the conditions in London itself, but the conditions of Ruth's life that made her so vulnerable. And that's as much of the tragedy as her death as well. She was not able to escape what the war had done to her.
Yeah.
So the murder of Ruth, and a lot of women like this, including Cummins victims, like there were so many strangers in the capital, the streets were blacked out. So many women were vulnerable to these attacks that it created kind of this new predatory kind of murder that certain killers really preyed on. And that's true also of the last one, who's a bit different. But the third serial killer, of course, is John Hay. And he knew his victim. It wasn't quite the same kind of stranger in the Blackout situation, but he was a con man and a thief who discovered a method, he thought, of disposing of bodies without a trace. And he befriended, I would say, a wealthy-ish young man, Donald McSwan, and they would hang about in pubs. And he wanted Donald's money, essentially. And so he killed him. He dissolved his body in a vat of acid. He told the elder McSwan, his parents, he'd run off to Scotland to avoid military service, which seemed plausible. But in 1945, conscription had ended, and his parents start asking questions. And then so John kills them as well and dissolves their bodies and disposes and sells of their property. And he continues that trajectory. And he's not caught until 1949, after he's killed at least 6 victims and maybe more. But again, it's not just the conditions of war, it's the excuses of war. It's plausible that someone would run away to avoid conscription. It's plausible that someone would leave London for the bombs. And so it's an easy way to cover it up. And there were no questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole era of people moving and disappearing and coming back, and marriages falling apart, or not, but being broken apart by loss, and then remarriage and relocation and evacuees and bombing out. I mean, it's in researching my family tree, that my family kind of just does they just got to scatter some of them in sort of 41 to 43. Then it all gets back to normal again after 50s. But it's just it's complicated. And if you're the kind of person that would take advantage of the situation, as you've been explaining, it's a perfect environment to do shitty stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I would argue, what in the book says, is that the war actually led to lasting changes in crime. And so this is post-war Commissioner Harold Scott, writing in 1954. And he says, a war to the death like the last one, in which the state perforce made great inroads on the liberties of the subjects and rights and property, was hardly the school in which one could expect respect for the law and the rights of others to flourish. And I think that's true to a certain extent. People got used to breaking the law in little ways with the black market and with the blackout and kind of flouting the law. But to me, it's really about the different attitudes to violence. People had been exposed to death in a way that they hadn't before. And if we look at the physical changes of the war, those bomb sites don't get built over really till the 60s or 70s. They're not filled in till the 90s. There's all kinds of crimes and murders and rapes taking place in those bomb sites. Of course, the servicemen are coming back with weapons. There's a lot more. London becomes a much more metropolitan place. There's a lot more racial tensions coming out. Of course, men are coming back to find their wives have been unfaithful. And so violence goes up actually in 1946 and stays high for a good 3 to 4 years after the war. And it never really goes back to that more parochial 1930s type of murder within the family where people just confess and the police already knows. It moves much more to a more professional investigation of crime and forensics.
Wow.
The story's a bit of a downer, to be honest.
Well, I'm feeling a little bit gloomy now, but yeah, we'll try and cheer ourselves up. But yeah, no, fascinating stuff though. So we've got a couple of questions. Most of them you've actually answered as we've gone along, which has been good. There's one particular one that I really want to come back to from Jim Grundy. And it's, has Dr. Bell undertaken any comparative research between the impact of crime in the UK of both world wars? During the Great War, violent crime and drunkenness dropped significantly, whereas you're saying World War II kind of sees the opposite. Is that fundamentally true, that statement by Jim there?
Oh, I think that's definitely true. And that if we do see World War I, there was kind of more property crime, but violent crime definitely drops, again, because of the separation of family, the lack of availability of alcohol. Where we do see a rise in crime is more young people towards the end of the war. And then there's a bit of a rise again with returning servicemen afterwards. But there isn't the same influx of people into the city because, of course, they're funneled through to the front.
Yeah, that's true. Not the multinational would have been in places like Paris and overseas, I guess. London, I don't suppose, really had that influx of it, which made a difference. It was a war that was over there as opposed to World War II being absolutely everywhere. Good point.
Well, yeah, and London becomes a bottleneck, right? So it's a transport hub within the UK, but it's a bottleneck of all those forces that are waiting for the second front to open.
Okay, well, that's that one. Gary Auger just asked about, was there there was a command response to soldiers' crimes? I mean, Jonathan Fennell and other historians have looked at the issues of desertion and things like that. I mean, obviously, London has a lot going on. You got a slight lull in 43 after the Blitz and before the V weapons come over. But I'm assuming the police are just generally too busy with things to start looking at, is violent crime increasing? And if it is there anything we can do about it? I'm assuming there wasn't really much of a response at a high level.
Well, there was. And so it's quite interesting. I didn't get into this because actually soldiers were policed by their own military police within London.
Of course.
So if there are kind of just general crimes, so crimes of property, that's supposed to be dealt with by the military police. And it's only in cases where crimes are committed really against British civilians or they're very violent crimes when those cases get handed over to the local police force. So the Metropolitan Police Force actually has to cooperate with the military police of whatever nation of the soldier that they're investigating. And I do talk in the book at least an example, a Canadian example, where we can see how that coordination works. But it's also politically really difficult because the Metropolitan Police can't say publicly or even in memos that there's an increase in crime because of Canadian and American soldiers in the capital. So they do write a report in 1943, I think, and it's about this increase in violence. And they say, I mean, typical bureaucracy speak, basically like the level of violent crime has essentially remained the same. But then if you look at the table that they provide, actually violent crime has doubled. Right. What they're saying is not necessarily what the statistics say. And that's only, of course, the recorded crime that isn't covered by the military police. So crimes that have been reported to the Metropolitan. And so there's a sense that the Metropolitan Police and the British government really wants to not talk about soldier crime. So it's reported in the case of murder, but it's not really, the police or the newspapers talk about it a little bit, but they don't want to acknowledge it because it's politically disturbing. And they also don't want to execute soldiers of other countries found guilty of murder.
And I'm guessing that there are potentially crimes that have never been discovered, and because there were people there, look at the fact that there are thousands of missing people in World War II, both military people missing in combat and also civilians just missing because of them. So although the protagonist you talked about earlier didn't get away with the murder, there may have been, people who did get away with it and were able to dump bodies in the right place or leave them and cover them. That's for someone like yourself researching it, the fact that there may be these undiscovered, fantastically interesting stories that shed light on that era must be somewhat frustrating.
Well, when I started the project 20 years ago, I was very arrogant. I'm like, I will find these missing, I will solve these crimes. But of course you can't. You can't solve crimes that are 50 years old. Although it's interesting, I went back and looked at the unidentified bombing victims file at the National Archives, and there were thousands. Most of them eventually get identified, but a lot of them don't. So there are over 200 people of all ages whose bodies are never claimed or identified or discovered. And they're found in all different neighborhoods. And you have to wonder, if you did want to commit a crime, that would be the way to do it. Leave someone out in the open or near a bombing. And if you're passing through or if no one knows who the person is, it's almost impossible to trace.
And the other question, which I'm not going to go into a massive, great rabbit hole, but Madcap was saying, were there less police during the war? And yes, but there were more people in positions of authority, but not crime solving. Buildings had guards outside them, regimental police, military police. The trains were highly regulated, but it was checking that the people had the right pass to get in the right place. It wasn't crime solving as such, was it? So there, even Christie was an authority figure, but in the end, he becomes the problem, not the cure. So less police, but weirdly more supervision, but not in the area we're talking about today, I guess.
Well, exactly. And the largest increase, of course, was civil defense. There were 3 million civil defense people who were called up, some paid, most volunteers, and they were the people on the ground doing raids, checking the blackout, kind of they're policing after a while. And so it's often that they are the first people to notice something go wrong, the first people on the scene, but they don't have police powers and they don't investigate. And so what's missing is that investigatory aspect, the detectives.
Yeah, and just as you've been saying earlier, just the fact that there is no normal routine for people to adhere to. People notice unusual things because it's different to the normal routine. But if you're living in certain parts of London, you've got, Indian troops coming down your road one day, you've got Australian troops there next week later, people's unloading anti-aircraft guns on a Tuesday, clearing up the rubble of a house on a Wednesday. There is no normal routine. So things that you would spot of that stranger who is out of place, you don't notice a stranger out of place in this environment because to an extent, everything is out of place. Everything is abstract and abnormal in this time. So that, we're going back to the discussion we've had earlier on. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. What's your hopes for the books? For the book, this particular one, but also your past one. You're looking for people, criminologists and people who crime fans, but also people who are into military history to kind of get that different point of view, I guess.
Well, I'm really interested, as I said, in the emotional side of war
Yeah.
and the human side of war. And so, there's been a lot of study on the effects of war, the effects of rationing or of military movements, but it's hard to actually get at what people felt.
Yeah.
And so crime records, and when we look at how people behave, and then again, the statements that they make help us understand this and understand the history of war in a way that I'm sure that they didn't intend to when they're investigating this crime. So it's very interesting to look at these wartime files from the lens of a war historian and to see all the aspects of war that people couldn't really see themselves because they're in it and it's happening to them.
No, absolutely. Well, we'll leave things there, folks. I'll hold up my copy of the book again, so you know what to do, folks. Go and buy a copy, or get it from your library or your local bookstore, whatever it is. But it's been I've got more questions in my head than which is always good. A good show leaves me thinking about things, and yeah, it's been fascinating. Some of these stories have been somewhat familiar, but you've given them a different spin and a different interpretation, which is fantastic. So there you are. It's been great talking to you, Amy. Folks, I'm back again with Steve Bourquet tomorrow to talk about Tubby Barton, the commander of the US 4th Infantry Division, his new book, and lots more shows coming your way. I've been setting them all up all day. So thank you very much for your fantastic questions. Thank you, Amy. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Paul.